Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. So we're going to look at the historical deductive arguments, understanding who could have been the author of the Quran. So one question that may remain is whether the assessment of the Quranic linguistic miracle, the Mu'jiza, can be ascertained by a non-Arabic speaker. So in the previous video we explained in a little detail, briefly covering the subject area, about how there are objective ways to analyze the Quranic composition. But ultimately this can only be assessed by those who are capable in the Arabic language. So now we want to look at this from a historical deductive argument in order to demonstrate from a historical analysis that the Quran was truly a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that therefore a non-Arab can look at the history and understand and come to the conclusion that this is indeed a sign or miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The essence of this argument is summed up by understanding that, and this is really important, if you have will to perform an action, so if you have this intention, this desire, this drive to perform the action, if you have the will to perform an action, and secondly, you have the capability of doing the action, then what will inevitably follow? The action. So if you have will plus capability equals the action. That's the point that we need to remember and think about throughout this video. We know that the Quran was first known to humanity in the 7th century. So if we go back every generation from our generation, people mention the Quran, the previous one, and so on and so forth. And if we go back throughout the whole of the centuries, they all referred to a book that the Muslims believed in called the Quran up until the 7th century. You go before the 7th century, no mention of Quran. After the 7th century, they start to mention the Quran. So the question is, secondly, we also know that the Quran was known to the people of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. So we have ample testimonial evidence to demonstrate, historical evidence, narrations, even written evidence that the Quran in the 7th century was revealed or was known to those people in the Arabian Peninsula. So the question we're going to look at is, in the 7th century, in the Arabian Peninsula, the Hijaz, who could have been the possible author of the Quran? Well, we have 4 possible authors. 1, it could be a non-Arab or the non-Arabs. Secondly, it could be the Arabs who produced the Quran. Thirdly, it could be the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or fourthly, it could be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the only 4 possible authors of the Quran within the 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula. We can easily discount that the non-Arabs could have been the author of the Quran. The Quran is in Arabic and thus requires someone who's aware of the Arabic language. It's an obvious point. Plus living in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. So a non-Arab by definition who doesn't know Arabic will not be the author of the Quran. This now leaves us with 3 possible authors for the Quran. Well, could the Quran have been produced by the Arabs of that time? We know that the Arabs were experts in the Arabic language. We mentioned in the previous videos that the Arabs prized language to a high degree. Composition of poetry was the method of preserving their history. They held competitions over who produced the best poetry. They had specialist poetry judges who could adjudicate the verses that were being produced. They'd be specially allocated areas in places like Mecca, in the marketplaces, where poets would, gather the people and start reciting poetry, and the best of them would achieve wealth and fame. They'd even send their children into the desert in order to preserve and develop the Arabic language. So they would send them to the Bedouin tribes, and the Bedouin tribes would raise their children in order, one of the reasons why, was to preserve the Arabic language, to make the Arabic language strong and pure before they come back into the cities and towns. And we know through multiple testimonial evidence about how important language was to the Arabs and how they would produce great works of poetry, as I mentioned. For example, an example of this is the famous Mu'alakat. The Mu'alakat are the 7 hanging poems that were hung inside the Kaaba. They were considered the best of the best poetry. They were the standard by which you would judge other poems and poetry against. So we certainly can consider the Arabs had a high degree of capability in the language. They were the experts. Secondly, we also know that the Arabs were challenged by the beliefs and the linguistic miracle of the Quran. The Arabs were pagan polytheists. They worshipped many idols. They saw monotheistic message of the Quran as a direct challenge to their belief, values and practices. Furthermore, some of their practices was severely criticized within the Quran and the Sunnah and the examples and the statements of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For example, the way they buried their daughters alive, the way the rich and the powerful of Mecca, known as the Quraysh, they were criticized for their exploitative practices, like the way they treated the weak, the poor, the orphans, or the slaves at that time. How tribalism was rampant within society that created war and division, or the economic malpractices and the cheating in the marketplaces. So the Quran criticized all this. This was part of the message of Islam. It shook the society. The Quran also criticized the corrupt leadership of Quraysh by name, like Abu Lahab, or others by implication, like Al-Walid ibn Mughira or Abu Jahl and others. So the Quran was revealed to a people who held beliefs, values and practices that was severely criticized. It wasn't surprising then that the people, in particular the powerful elite in Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula, opposed the message of the Quran and the claim of prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they opposed the Prophet sallam. We know this from the historical narratives and historical narrations. They slandered the Prophet sallam. They attacked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They attacked, tortured and killed the companions around the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They boycotted the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his followers in Mecca. And they even conspired in the end, before his emigration, to assassinate the Prophet sallam. Later on, when the Prophet sallam, established an Islamic state in Medina, they sent their armies to fight against the Prophet ﷺ and Islam, to stop Islam and the message of the Quran. So what does this tell us? It tells us there was clearly a will, a desire to see Islam destroyed. The Quran not only challenged the Quraysh and the Arab society's beliefs, values, but also made an audacious claim about how to destroy Islam, how to challenge the Quran and refute the prophethood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Quran is turning around and saying, well, if you don't believe that this book is revelation, then produce one surah like it. And we know that the shortest surah of the Quran is Surah Al-Kawthar, 3 sentences long, that's all. This is all they had to produce. 3 sentences that matched the eloquence of the Quran, using the rules of the balagha known to the Arabs at the time, at least implicitly, and as a result they would have demonstrated that the Quran is not inimitable, is not miraculous, but was within human production and therefore was not from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's a bold challenge that the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is making, and so it becomes very easy in our minds to realize that, hold on, if they had that strong desire to destroy Islam and they had the capability in the Arabic language, but they did not produce the surah of Quran also a surah like the Quran, 3 sentences like a surah of Quran, then it demonstrates that actually, there's something here. Maybe they didn't have the capability to produce it. Romani, who is a 10th century scholar, stated, the inimitability of the Quran is manifested by the fact that despite a huge number of claimants and a dire need to respond, the challenge was never taken up, it was never met. If then they met the challenge, if they actually did meet the challenge of the Quran, it would be clear that with their desire to destroy Islam, they would have spread this far and wide across the Arabian Peninsula. We have met the challenge of the Quran. We have imitated something like a surah of the Quran. So therefore, it's a simple but profound point. But if we say that the absence of proof, or the absence of the proof of something that challenges the Quran hasn't been met, then there is proof for its absence. Let me just rephrase that. The absence of proof is proof for its absence. What do I mean by this? The absence of the fact that there is something that challenges the Quran by the best of the Arabs is a proof that the Arabs could not challenge the Quran. They wanted to destroy Islam. They had the capability in the Arabic language. They had the desire, but they didn't have the ability to produce anything on the level of the Quran. So we can see, therefore, so Al-Jahiz in Hujjaj al-Nabuwah, he commented upon this point. He said, in spite of their strong motivation on account of their tribal pride and opposition to Islam, and in spite of the fact that meeting the challenge would have been easier for them than fighting the Muslims, like engaging the Muslims in battle as they did, only to lose eventually, that all they had to do is meet the challenge of the Quran, but they didn't. And that is an indication that they couldn't produce something like the Quran. Like I said, if you have will, either desire, the intention to do something, and you have the capability, you're going to get an action. If you don't have an action, which in this situation is a replication of the Quran or something like the Quran, but you do know you have the will, then what is missing in the equation? Capability, i.e. the ability to produce something like the Quran. And we also know from various statements from the Arabs at the time that actually testified to the superior nature of the Quranic language. For example, Al-Walid ibn Mughira, he replied about the Quran. He goes, "What can I possibly say? There is not a single man who is more knowledgeable of poetry or prose than I, or even that of the jinn. And by Allah, what he says bears no resemblance to these things. By Allah, what he says, i.e. the Quran, has a sweetness to it and a charm upon it. The highest part of it is fruitful, and the lowest part of it is gushing forth with bounty. It dominates and cannot be dominated, and it crushes all that is under it." So it should be also noted that this quote from Al-Walid ibn Mughira, who is testifying to the superiority of the Quran, actually remained an ardent opponent to the Prophet ﷺ. He was one of the leaders of the Quraysh. But there were other people who were poets at that time, like At-Tufayl ad-Dawsi, like Labib ibn Rabi'a. Labib, he was, radiallahu an, he was one of those people who was one of the authors of one of the seven poems that was hanging in the Kaaba. And yet, when he heard Surah Al-Kawthar recited to him, he was shocked by it and he embraced Islam. Similarly, At-Tufayl ad-Dawsi, in the story about how when he heard the verses of Quran, he was known for his language, poetry and education, he embraced Islam. Or the story of Umar radiallahu an, who after hearing the first 7 or so verses of Surah Al-Taha, embraced Islam. Now someone might claim, someone might claim that the reason why we don't have a verses comparable to the Quran is because the Muslims destroyed all challenges against the Quran. Somebody came, produced a challenge, they killed him off before he could spread it. But the Quraysh had 13 years before the migration, the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ to compose 3 sentences and spread that message far and wide, that the Quran has been matched. Furthermore, even when the Prophet ﷺ arrived in Medina to establish the first Islamic state, Mecca and Quraysh still remained strong and independent. Most of the Arabian Peninsula was still non-Muslim, and therefore they had ample time and opportunity to match the Quran. In fact, it was after 8 years of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina did Mecca open up to Islam. And also we know that even towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, life in this world, that there were people that came like Musaylama the liar, or Musaylama from Banu Hanifa tribe, who also declared himself the Prophet, and he began trying to imitate the Prophet ﷺ by reciting verses, And there's a famous story in which Amr ibn al-As radiallahu an, he came to Musaylama and he asked Musaylama, "You claim to be a prophet, recite some verses." And I think he recited some different narrations, but one of the narrations says, "Al-fil mal-fil wa ma adraka mal-fil lahu anfil ta'wil," which basically means the elephant. What is the elephant? What will make you visualize the elephant? It has a long nose and a short tail. Yeah. And so Amr ibn al-As said, you know that I know that you're a liar, that you're not really a prophet. So they were people who actually went into other areas within the Arabian Peninsula, even towards the end of the life of the Prophet, some trying to spread their poetry, and this poetry became known. but also it was also a self-refuting challenge. It refuted them as having anything that was inimitable. So we can see that there was sufficient time and opportunity to ensure that if the Quraysh and the Arabs were able to match the Quran, they could have spread it and spread this idea throughout the Arabian Peninsula. In fact, this claim that the victors could remove the challenge is not something we see when we assess the reality. When we look at the reality, we don't see this. There have been many occasions where states have tried to destroy an idea, but it was just too difficult. It was just too held too much by too many people and too strongly. As we mentioned about the Soviet Union, who tried to remove religion from the society, but it was held on to the people. So even though they tried to do it by the force of the state, it still continued. Or even, during the periods of certain times of the Khilafah where they tried to adopt on the Mu'tazila creed and they tried to, enforce that creed, it didn't stop people still adhering to the other creeds. So this idea that, the Muslims somehow achieved dominance and destroyed, it's just false. It's just not a correct and a rational concept regards to that. And only that, but also the Islamic State, when it spread in the early period, so did the Arabic language. So when new lands were opened up, and many of these new lands had a large number of non-Muslims, they also started to learn Arabic. So you had non-Muslims in these lands, in the Arabic-speaking lands, who spoke Arabic, who also had the access or the ability to produce something like the Quran. But yet, throughout the whole of the Islamic history, all of the Muslim history, or 1400 years of the challenge, we've not seen one single person being able to match it in a credible way. So what we've demonstrated that not only were the Arabs had a strong desire to destroy Islam and they had a very relatively simple way of doing it, but we also showed that they didn't do it. They were simply unable to produce something like the Quran. So it's very clear. Did the Arabs produce Quran? No, of course they didn't. So this now leaves the last two possibilities. Could it have been the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Well, we can discount the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as being the author of the Quran. One, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would recite the verses in response to various incidences at times of war, in response to questions, in response to accusations. And as soon as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam recited the verse was now, memorized, understood, heard. And if he had made one single grammatical mistake in over 6,000 verses, it would have been easy to point it out. It is, I would say it is impossible to speak in a grammatically perfect way. You have to write it down. You have to look at what you're saying, and that way you can understand if it's grammatical. You have to revise it. You edit it. You make mistakes. This is the nature of a human being. We make mistakes. But yet the Prophet ﷺ was reciting these verses perfectly, not only perfectly in terms of grammar, but the highest form of speech in a unique genre. So we know that, therefore, from that point of view. Secondly, is that the Prophet ﷺ was known to be the unlettered prophet. He wasn't known to have the ability to, read or write or compose literature or compose poetry as well. And this is what was understood about the Prophet ﷺ. In the 40 years prior to Prophet, the Prophet ﷺ never recited or composed any forms of poetry. He was not known for that. So for a person who has, he's considered unlettered, producing the highest form of Arabic language that even still today upholds, again, it doesn't seem possible, that the Prophet ﷺ could produce that. Thirdly, the point here is really important. If the Prophet ﷺ was the author of the Quran, then the Quran would be within human capability. If then one person could produce it, somebody else could replicate it. And that's because, and we mentioned this before about Isa alayhi salam, that if a person produces something novel, all they're doing is taking the prevalent knowledge, previous information that exists within the environment, and maybe arranging it in a way which is novel at that moment, but then other people can look at and see what they're doing, reverse engineer it, and produce something of similar quality towards this. So when the Prophet ﷺ, if the Prophet ﷺ produced the Quran, somebody else could use it, so look at it, understand it, reverse engineer it, and produce something similar to it. Fourth reason why it couldn't be the Prophet ﷺ, the prophetic hadith, the language, the Prophet ﷺ's language, we know in prophetic hadith, and some of these hadith are hadith mutawatir, clear cut, we know that it definitely came from the Prophet ﷺ, is completely different in terms of the verses of Quran. For example, the way the sentences are constructed, the types of words that are used, the style of language indicate that they are completely distinct authors. And also the Quran contains information like predictions of future events and historical events which were simply outside of the Prophet ﷺ's capability of knowing. And there's numerous examples of this. Therefore, it becomes absolutely clear that the Quran could not have been written nor composed by the Prophet ﷺ. So if we've just discounted the non-Arabs, and we've discounted the Arabs, and we've discounted the Prophet ﷺ, who's one of the Arabs anyway, as being the possible author in the 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula, then who could be the only possible author of the Quran? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, obviously. So to summarize, the Quran was first known in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century Common Era. The Arabs were highly capable in the Arabic language. The Arabs sought to destroy Islam as it was antagonistic to their beliefs, values, practices and societal structures. If they were able to produce free sentences like the Quran, then the intellectual challenge would have been met and the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ would have ended there and then. No challenge was ever met. We know this by first the absence of any similar verses like the Quran. We also know this because the Quran remains unchallenged and Quran exists today. If it had been met 1400 years ago, nobody would have taken it forward beyond that. Secondly, thirdly, the fact that there still remains the intellectual challenge found within the Quran. And finally, the Arabs themselves testified that no human being could produce or replicate the Quran. The Prophet ﷺ is one of the Arabs. If he produced the Quran, then other people could have produced the Quran. Therefore, the only possibility, the only possible author of the Quran for this historical deductive or historical analysis method for a deductive process means that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have been the possible author of the Quran. What if somebody claims that maybe somebody in the future could replicate the Quran? Well, if we've proven that the author back 1400 years ago is the Lord of the worlds, the all-knowing, and if the Lord of the world and the all-knowing states that no human being will produce something like the Quran, then we can take that as definitive knowledge, and therefore nobody in the future will be able to produce the Quran if we've proven who was the author in the past. There's many more points that can be mentioned in regards to this historical deductive method. We've not mentioned also some of the non-Muslim Orientalists throughout history that have talked about the inimitable excellence of the Quran, like for example the professor of Oriental Studies Martin Zammit, or the Orientalist A.J. Avery, or Professor Bruce Lawrence, or Hamilton Gribb, or Palmer, or numerous other writers from the non-Muslims. And we've not even mentioned the Muslims and what they have said, like Barkalani, Jurjani and others. All of this clearly indicates to us, and numerous testimonial evidence, numerous examples, that the Quran has a divine origin. And just as one final point, just like, when we turn around and say, oh, can a non-Arab understand the Quran? We're not experts. Just like the people around who saw the magicians compete with Musa alayhi salam could not make the assessment of whether Musa alayhi salam's actions was magic or was it a miracle, that they were able to base their belief that it was indeed a miracle because of whom? The experts testifying to the inimitable nature of Musa alayhi salam's miracle. And we have the exact same thing. We have the experts in the Arabic language who testify to the inimitable nature of the Quranic language and therefore the prophethood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.